September 19, 1944. The Lorraine region of France. 7:30 hours. The fog was so thick you could taste it. It clung to the muddy fields of the Arracourt sector like a wet wool blanket, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards. Oberleutnant Hans von Luck, commanding a company of the 113th Panzer Brigade, stood in the cupola of his Panther tank. The steel beneath his boots hummed with the idle vibration of a 700-horsepower Maybach engine. He felt invincible. And he had every reason to. His Panther was the apex predator of 1944. It weighed 45 tons. Its frontal armor was 80 millimeters of sloped, hardened steel that could deflect almost any Allied shell in existence. Its 75 millimeters high-velocity cannon could punch a hole through an American Sherman tank from 2 kilometers away, long before the American could even see him. German intelligence had briefed them that morning. "You are facing the American 4th Armored Division," the report said. "They are equipped with Shermans. They are slow. They are weak. They burn easily." Von Luck signaled his driver to advance. The massive Panzer began to crawl forward, its wide tracks churning the French mud. Behind him, a column of steel giants followed. They were hunting. Suddenly, the mist to his left swirled violently. Von Luck spun his periscope. He expected to see a Sherman, tall, boxy, lumbering. Instead, he saw something that didn't make sense. It was low. Incredibly low. It hugged the ground like a sports car. It had no roof. He could see the tops of the crew's helmets exposed to the damp air. The armor plates looked impossibly thin, bolted together like a rush job at a civilian auto plant. "Target left," his gunner screamed. "Range 200 meters." The Panther's electric turret traverse whined. The massive long-barreled gun began to swing. It was a slow, deliberate mechanical movement. The German crew knew the drill. Lock on. Fire. Watch the American burn. But the American machine didn't wait to die. With a roar that sounded more like an airplane than a tank, the strange vehicle leaped forward. It didn't accelerate slowly, it launched. Its tracks tore huge divots of earth from the ground as it accelerated from 0 to 30 miles per hour in seconds. The German gunner tried to track it, but his turret was too slow. The American vehicle was drifting, literally sliding sideways in the mud as it circled the lumbering Panther. It moved with a frantic, terrifying agility. "Faster!" Von Luck yelled. "Track him!" It was too late. The toy tank had already flanked them. It disappeared into the fog behind the Panther. A split second later, a crack of thunder split the air. A 76 millimeters hypervelocity shell slammed into the Panther's rear engine deck, where the armor was thinnest. The impact was catastrophic. The Maybach engine disintegrated. Fuel lines ruptured. The ammunition stored in the sponsons detonated with a force that blew the Panther's 5-ton turret clean off the hull. As Von Luck scrambled out of his burning machine, coughing in the smoke, he realized the terrible truth. The intelligence report was wrong. They weren't fighting Shermans. They were fighting something entirely new. Something the Germans had no name for. To the Americans, it was the M18. But soon, the German army would give it a different name. They would call it the Ghost. They would call it the Sardine Can in mockery, and then the Witch in fear. But history would remember it by the name painted on its side. The Hellcat. This is the story of the fastest tracked fighting vehicle of World War II. It is the story of a machine designed by car guys, driven by adrenaline junkies, and built with a philosophy that terrified traditional generals. That armor doesn't save you. Speed saves you. The Germans laughed at its open top. They mocked its paper-thin skin. But on the battlefields of Europe, the laughter died quickly. Because they learned the hard way. It doesn't matter how thick your armor is, if you are too slow to catch the thing that is killing you. To understand why the Hellcat existed, we have to go back to a crisis of faith in the U.S. Army in 1941. The world was watching the German blitzkrieg. Nazi panzers were sweeping across Europe, crushing France and pushing the British into the sea. The U.S. Army looked at its own inventory and panicked. They had nothing that could stop a German armored assault. The traditional answer was, build bigger tanks. If the Germans have a 40-ton tank, we build a 50-ton tank. If they have 100 millimeters of armor, we put on 150 millimeters. But one man disagreed. Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair was the commander of Army Ground Forces. He was a brilliant, stubborn, and controversial mathematician of war. He looked at the problem of stopping a blitzkrieg and he saw a flaw in the logic of tank versus tank. McNair believed that using tanks to fight other tanks was wasteful. In his doctrine, the American Sherman tank was designed to support infantry, break through lines, and wreak havoc in the rear. It wasn't a duelist. Tanks are offensive weapons, McNair argued. If you use them defensively to fight other tanks, you lose the initiative. So, how do you stop a panzer division? McNair's solution was radical. He created a completely new branch of the military, the Tank Destroyer Force. The philosophy was summed up in their motto: seek, strike, and destroy. These units wouldn't sit in defensive lines waiting to be hit. They would be hunters. They would lie in wait, ambush the enemy armor, destroy it, and vanish before the Germans could return fire. To do this, they didn't need heavy armor. In fact, armor was a liability. Armor meant weight. Weight meant a bigger engine, bigger transmission, and slower speed. McNair wanted a sniper rifle on tracks. He issued a requirement to U.S. industry that sounded impossible. The vehicle must carry a gun powerful enough to crack any known German tank. It must weigh less than 20 tons. It must reach speeds of 50 miles per hour. The engineers at General Motors and Buick, men who spent their lives building family sedans and racing engines, looked at these specs and smiled. This wasn't a military problem. This was an automotive problem. It was a hot rod problem. They knew exactly how to solve it. Strip the weight, add the power. They took a radical approach. They designed a suspension system using torsion bars, steel rods that twisted to absorb shock, allowing the vehicle to glide over bumps that would rattle the teeth out of a Sherman crew. Then they dropped in the engine. Not a truck engine. An aircraft engine. The Continental R975. A 9-cylinder radial monster that pumped out 400 horsepower. But to keep the weight under 20 tons, they had to make a sacrifice that terrified the Army brass. They stripped the armor. The frontal plate of the prototype was 1 inch thick. The sides were ½ an inch. To put that in perspective, a standard German heavy machine gun firing armor-piercing bullets could punch right through the side of the vehicle at close range. A handheld Panzerfaust rocket would incinerate it. And then, the most controversial decision of all, they removed the roof. The turret was completely open. No hatch. No steel plate. Just the open sky. The designers argued it was necessary to save weight and give the crew 360-degree visibility. But when the first crews saw the blueprints, they were appalled. "You want us to go into combat in a convertible?" one sergeant asked. "What about rain? What about snow? What about snipers? What about grenades?" The instructors at Camp Hood had a grim response. "You don't need a roof if you're fast enough to not get hit." It was a gamble. A massive, industrial gamble. The U.S. Army was betting thousands of lives on the idea that speed was better than steel. The men who were selected for the tank destroyer battalions were not your average soldiers. The Army looked for a specific psychological profile. They wanted aggression. They wanted initiative. They wanted men who, in civilian life, drove fast cars and got into bar fights. They called themselves suicide jockeys. Training at Camp Hood in Texas was brutal. The crews were taught to unlearn everything they knew about tank warfare. In a tank, you feel safe. You are encased in a womb of steel. You feel powerful. In a Hellcat, you feel naked. Veterans recalled the feeling of sitting in the commander's seat, head exposed to the wind, watching the ground blur past at 50 miles per hour. It was exhilarating, but it was terrifying. You learned to be paranoid, recalled Sergeant Frank Ross of the 805th Tank Destroyer Battalion. In a Sherman, you can be a little sloppy. You can take a hit and maybe survive. In a Hellcat, if you take a hit, you are dead. Period. There is no second chance. The training focused on shoot and scoot. Drive to a ridge. Peek over. Fire. Reverse immediately. Move 100 yards left. Pop up again. They practiced until their hands bled. Drivers learned to drift the 17-ton vehicle like a rally car. Gunners learned to fire while the suspension was still settling. Loaders learned to slam 76mm shells into the breech while bouncing over ditches. But there was a problem looming on the horizon. While the Americans were perfecting their glass cannon, the Germans were upgrading their armor. In 1942, the German Tiger tank appeared. In 1943, the Panther. These tanks had frontal armor so thick that the Hellcat's original 76mm guns struggled to penetrate them from the front. Reports from the testing grounds were alarming. The 76mm shell bounces off the Panther's glassy plate at anything over 100 yards, one report read. The crews knew this. They knew that if they met a Panther head-on, their shells would shatter harmlessly against the German steel, and the German return fire would turn their sardine can into a funeral pyre. The solution wasn't better armor. It was better tactics. "Don't fight them fair," the instructors screamed. "If you see a Panther looking at you, you've already messed up. Hit them in the side. Hit them in the rear. Hit them where they aren't looking." By the time the Hellcats deployed to Europe in 1944, the crews were a strange mix of terrified and arrogant. They knew they were driving the fastest thing on the battlefield. They knew they had the firepower to kill anything if they got close enough. But they also knew that every German gunner, sniper, and grenade thrower looked at their open turret and saw an easy kill. September 1944. General Patton's Third Army was tearing across France. Patton loved the Hellcat. He was a cavalryman at heart. He loved speed. He famously said, "I don't want to pay for the same real estate twice." He wanted to keep moving. The Hellcat was the only vehicle that could keep up with Patton's ego. But Hitler had a surprise for Patton. He gathered the remnants of his panzer forces, the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades. These were not ragged units. They were equipped with factory-fresh Panther tanks. Their orders were simple: cut off Patton's spearhead and destroy the 4th Armored Division. The collision happened near the town of Arracourt. It is one of the largest tank battles in U.S. history, yet few people know about it because it wasn't a stand-up fight. It was a knife fight in a phone booth. The weather was atrocious. Fog, rain, and mud. The U.S. Air Force, the P-47 Thunderbolts that usually smashed German armor, was grounded. The tankers were on their own. On the morning of September 19th, a platoon of 4 Hellcats from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion was patrolling a ridgeline. They were commanded by Lieutenant Edwin Leeper. Leeper was looking for infantry. Instead, through the lifting fog, he saw a nightmare. Emerging from the mist, less than 400 yards away, were the distinct, sloping silhouettes of German Panthers. And not just one. A whole company. In any other vehicle, Leeper would have reversed and called for artillery. A Sherman platoon engaging a Panther company head-on at 400 yards is suicide. But Leeper checked his map. He checked his terrain. And he checked his tachometer. "Driver, advance," he ordered. The German commanders in the Panthers must have been confused. They saw muzzle flashes from the treeline, but by the time they turned their heavy turrets, the muzzle flashes were gone. The Hellcats were executing a maneuver that was impossible for a tank. They were firing, dropping the transmission into reverse, backing down the slope, racing 50 yards laterally along the ridge, and popping up in a new spot. To the Germans, it looked like they were facing a battalion of tanks. Everywhere they looked, a gun fired. Leeper's gunner, Corporal Henry, spotted a Panther exposing its flank. On the way. The 76mm shell screamed across the valley. It slammed into the Panther's side armor just above the tracks. The German tank brewed up instantly, a pillar of fire erupting into the fog. But now the Germans knew where they were. An 88mm shell from a Tiger whistled past Leeper's turret, the shockwave knocking the breath out of his crew. "Move! Move! Move!" Leeper screamed. The driver floored it. The Hellcat surged forward, tracks spinning in the mud. They broke cover and charged toward the German formation, diving into a shallow ravine. This was the moment the M18 was built for. Inside the ravine, hidden from view, the Hellcats raced parallel to the German advance at 45 miles per hour. They were flanking the entire enemy force. When they emerged from the ravine, they were behind the German line. It was a slaughter. The Hellcats fired into the thin rear armor of the Panthers. 1, 2, 3 German tanks exploded in rapid succession. The German formation panicked. They tried to turn their hulls to face the new threat, but the mud slowed them down. The Hellcats were dancing around them like boxers fighting heavyweights. By the end of the skirmish, Leeper's platoon of 4 Hellcats had destroyed 7 Panthers and damaged several others. They had lost 3 M18s, but the trade-off was staggering. The Battle of Arracourt raged for days. It proved that the American doctrine worked. The heavy German cats, the Tigers and Panthers, were superior on paper. They had better guns and better armor. But they were blind and they were slow. The Hellcat was the predator the Germans never expected. It was the mongoose fighting the cobra. But courage and speed weren't the only things winning these battles. There was a secret weapon stored in the ammunition racks of the Hellcat. For years, American crews had complained that their shells shattered against German armor. In late 1944, the Army finally delivered the solution: HVP. High-velocity armor piercing. Standard tank shells were just hardened steel slugs. HVP was different. It was a lightweight aluminum carrier wrapping around a core of tungsten carbide. Tungsten is one of the densest, hardest metals on Earth. It is twice as dense as steel. When fired, the lightweight aluminum shell allowed the projectile to reach incredible speeds, 3,400 feet per second. Upon impact, the aluminum stripped away, and the tungsten needle punched through the German armor with kinetic energy that was almost physics-defying. Suddenly, the Hellcat's 76mm gun could penetrate the front of a Tiger tank at 1,000 yards. But there was a catch. Tungsten was rare. It was needed for machine tools back home. HVP shells were issued in tiny numbers. A Hellcat crew might only get 2 or 3 rounds per month. These rounds became gold. Crews hoarded them. They hid them from inspections. They saved them for the "oh God" moments, when a Tiger appeared around a corner and there was no way to flank it. "We kept the HVP in the ready rack right next to the breech," recalled Gunner Joas, of the 704th. "We called it the silver bullet. You knew if you fired that, you had one chance. If you missed, you were dead before you could reload." Then there was the controversy of the open top. While crews hated the rain and the cold, they discovered a tactical advantage that the designers hadn't even planned for. Situational awareness. Inside a German Panther, the commander is buttoned up. He is looking through thick glass blocks or a narrow periscope. His field of view is tiny. The engine noise inside the steel box is deafening. He is effectively deaf and tunnel-visioned. In the Hellcat, the crew is outside. They can hear. Veterans spoke of hearing the squeak of German tracks long before they saw the tank. They could hear the snap of twigs. They could smell the exhaust fumes of a diesel engine idling in an ambush. "We hunted by ear," said Sergeant Ray Force. "We'd cut the engine and just listen. You could hear a Tiger a mile away. It sounded like a rock crusher. We'd wait for him to turn a corner, and we'd have our gun laid on the spot before his nose even appeared." This allowed the Hellcats to land the first blow. And in tank warfare, the guy who shoots first usually wins. The ultimate test of the Hellcat came in the darkest days of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. December 1944. The Germans launched their last, desperate gamble to break the Allied lines. They threw everything they had at the Ardennes forest. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at the crossroads town of Bastogne. It was freezing. They were out of ammo, out of food, and out of medical supplies. And bearing down on them was the 2nd Panzer Division. Holding the northern perimeter at a tiny village called Neuville was a mixed force known as Team de Sobry. It was a hodgepodge of infantry, a few Sherman tanks, and a platoon of M18 Hellcats from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion. The conditions were a nightmare for a speed-based vehicle. The ground was ice. The fog was blinding. Speed should have been impossible. But the Hellcat crews didn't care. When the German attack began, massive waves of German armor rolled out of the mist. Panthers, Panzer IVs, and infantry. Major de Sobry commanded the defense. He expected to be overrun in an hour. Instead, the Hellcats went to work. In the confusing, swirling fog of Neuville, the Hellcats turned the village streets into a deadly maze. They didn't act like static pillboxes. They acted like raptors. A Hellcat would race down a narrow alleyway, sliding on the ice. The driver would wrestle the steering levers to drift the tank around a corner. They would fire a single shot into the flank of a passing German column, and then reverse at full speed before the Germans could spot the muzzle flash. It was urban guerrilla warfare with 17-ton vehicles. One Hellcat commander, Sergeant John "Red" McPhee, became a legend in Noville. Positioned near the village cemetery, McPhee spotted a German tank formation advancing. Most crews would have retreated. McPhee signaled his driver to attack. They surged forward, breaking cover. McPhee's gunner put a shell into the lead tank. It exploded. The German column halted, blocked by the burning wreck. Then McPhee did something insane. Instead of reversing, he ordered his driver to flank right, circling around the stalled column. They drove through the enemy fire, rounds sparking off their thin hull. They got behind the second tank and killed it. Then the third. In 20 minutes, a single Hellcat destroyed 3 German tanks and stalled an entire company-level attack. The German commander of the 2nd Panzer Division reported to his superiors that Noville was held by a heavy concentration of anti-tank guns and fortified bunkers. He couldn't believe that he was being stopped by a handful of open-topped convertibles driven by kids who were drifting on the ice. By the time Team de Sobry finally retreated from Noville, they had destroyed over 30 German tanks. The delay they caused broke the momentum of the German drive on Bastogne. The Hellcat had proven that it could fight anywhere. In the mud of France, in the hills of Italy, and in the snow of the Ardennes. By the spring of 1945, the M18s were loose in Germany. This was the phase they were built for. The breakout. Hellcat battalions were often operating 20 or 30 miles ahead of the main American army. They were capturing towns before the German mayors even knew the Americans were close. They were driving down the autobahns at 60 miles per hour, waving at German civilians who watched in shock. They captured airfields by simply driving onto the runway and chasing the German planes before they could take off. But as the war ended, the age of the tank destroyer ended with it. The U.S. Army looked at the data. They saw that while the Hellcat was successful, the doctrine was flawed. Having separate tanks and tank destroyers was confusing. They wanted a single vehicle that could do both. They wanted a main battle tank. The Hellcats were retired. Thousands were melted down for scrap. A few were sold to foreign armies, Yugoslavia, Venezuela, South Korea, where they served for decades longer. Today, only a handful remain in museums. But the legacy of the M18 Hellcat isn't just in the metal. It's in the philosophy. The Hellcat proved that on the modern battlefield, mobility is survivability. It proved that a smart, aggressive crew in a fragile vehicle can defeat a superior enemy if they strike first and move fast. The German Tiger crews laughed when they first saw the little open-topped cars. They called them toys. They called them coffins. But the men of the 704th, the 705th, and the 805th battalions had the last laugh. They drove the fastest tank of the war all the way to Hitler's doorstep. And they did it with the wind in their hair. This is forgotten thunder. The weapons they laughed at. The stories they forgot.